Hi, this is Eric, and I'm back with a video. It is Thursday, July 31st, and I want to talk about something that's been on my mind for a while. I'm calling it Schizophrenic Germany. What are the roots of German hatred towards Russia? So I've written an article which is posted on my website, but I'm also posting it here on Substack. And basically what I'm talking about is the fact that in just recently, as many of you may know, there was something called the Nord Stream pipeline, and the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation had been supplying Germany with this natural gas through pipelines for many decades, actually. And at a certain point, because of I think it was because of the problems of sending gas through pipelines through Ukraine because of the Ukraine conflict, and for whatever other reasons. Angela Merkel, who was the leader of Germany at the time, convinced Russia to build a pipeline. It was a consortium. It was a joint project where they would send natural gas under the Baltic Sea from Russia to Germany. And at a certain point, the Germans became hostile to Russia, and the United States, the President of the United States said, if Russia goes into Ukraine, that pipeline will not exist. And sure enough, the pipeline was blown up, or in fact, actually, there were 3 lines of that pipeline, and one of them apparently is still could be operational if Germany wanted them to, but they've rejected it. So the question is, what is going on here? And so I've written this whole article about it. And basically what I'm saying is that Germany has had a complicated relationship with Russia, and as we all know, in 1941, Germany invaded Russia along with a number of other its allies. Which included Hungary, Bulgaria, Finland, Italy, Romania, several other countries, as well as German collaborators from countries like Spain, which was officially neutral, but people would, some people would volunteer to fight. But this raised a whole question in my mind. Was like, what is going on with this? Because there's some commentators who feel that Germany has this just eternal hatred towards Russia. Germany is a vile country with hateful people, and they just cause all these wars. And now, in my own case, when I was in college, I decided to major in German because, among other things, the fact that my family is Jewish, and one whole wing of my family was killed by the Nazis in Lithuania, and I wanted to understand what was going on here, and in my studies of German, I realized that Germany has a whole history of which I go through in my article, a whole history of great writers and thinkers. One of my first courses was this course called German Romanticism, and it was about it was written by a very young man named Novalis, who wrote something called an Entwicklungsroman, which means it's a novel about one's internal development. It's kind of like a journal, you might say, of someone's inner journey. And one of the things that he commented on was the fact that there are these, what he called Philistines, these sort of petite bourgeois, the kind of mindless business people, these shallow people who don't really think about what's important in life, that kind of thing. But then you had people like Goethe, who was one of the great writers of all time. Schiller was another great writer. Many philosophers, Wittgenstein, Kant. Of course, there's that guy that was probably the most influential philosopher of the 19th century, named what was it? Karl Marx. Oh yeah, that guy. And for some reason, in my college years, living in the United States, Marx did not even appear on the syllabus. We do not want you to think outside of the capitalist box. Really interesting. But in any case, you had this whole group of philosophers and writers and poets going back, literally hundreds of years. And then on the other hand, you had people like, Beethoven and Schumann and Schubert and Bach and all these great classical composers of some of the most incredible music that's ever been written. And then you have the whole group of scientists like Einstein and Heisenberg and people like them, who Max Planck. These were some of the greatest scientists that the world had. And right around I'll back up a little bit in terms of history. So Germany in the mid-19th century was not actually a unified country. It was made up of a number of, you could say, statelets or principalities or dukedoms, things like that. And but there was an urge in Germany for democracy and democratization, and this took place in the aftermath of the French Revolution, of course, which spread liberty, equality, and brotherhood, fraternity. So Germany was waking up to these ideas, and they wanted part of that. So there was a revolution that took place in around 1848, and unfortunately, you could say the nobility and the powers that be in this German cultural space got control, and that was repressed. Now, granted, there was some concessions to these kind of democratic movements, so there was the beginnings of kind of parliamentary system, but it was still really under the control of the monarchy. And then I think it was around 1880 or so, Otto von Bismarck basically got the idea. He managed to coalesce all of these principalities and make them into a country that was one country called Germany, with a Kaiser, with a king, with a monarch named Kaiser. I think it was Kaiser Wilhelm during World War I, but I'm not sure who the Kaiser was when Germany was first started. But in any case, it was unified as one country. And then what happened was that because Germany was developing very fast and it had this really big pool of intellectual talent, they wanted part of the kind of colonial pie that had been divvied up between the French and the British and the Portuguese, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy. These countries had basically gone around the world, capturing countries. The British captured in India and made it a colony, and England captured, I guess, Kenya and South Africa. The British and the Dutch fought over South Africa. The Netherlands had Indonesia. China was sort of, but it wasn't a full colony, but it was partially occupied by many of these colonial countries. But essentially, what happened was that by the beginning of around 1900, the British saw the Germans as a real threat to their to British hegemony. Britain at that time, the UK, Great Britain was basically the leading empire in the world, and they didn't like the idea of an upstart Germany. So eventually, all of that ended up as World War I, And Germany thought that they were going to be able to win that war because they actually did have quite a bit of power. However, at a certain point, the British convinced the United States to come into the war, and that kind of was the tipping point, so that this mass slaughter, what can I call it? It was a stalemate of a war during World War I, and when the United States came in, they basically turned that whole situation around. Germany was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty, which forced them to pay back essentially the loans that France and England had incurred with the United States. The United States basically financed the war. So Germany was, not only did they lose that war, they lost their financial sovereignty, and they went through a really terrible period of hyperinflation where, when the rate of inflation was like thousands of %. And that was a complete catastrophe for this country that had been, a developing country. It was a proud country, and but it was smashed. Then you had the Depression that took place in 1929. And at that point, Germany was again in dire straits. And that basically, what happened there was that Germany had three factions. It had a social democratic faction, it had a communist faction, and it had a fascist faction, the National Socialists, otherwise known as the Nazis. What is not known well is the fact that the Nazi Party actually got quite a bit of support from Western industrialists and even from the British monarchy. So so basically in 1933, the Nazi Party, even though it only had, I think it was like 1/3 of the vote in the parliament, there was some chicanery going on behind the scenes, and von Hindenburg, who was a great military leader and nominal head of the country, allowed Adolf Hitler to become the Chancellor of Germany. And then shortly after that, there was a big fire at the Reichstag, which is you could say the German equivalent of the U.S. Capitol building. Germany then went into a period called the Enabling Act, where the Nazis basically said the communists did this, we have to crack down on them, we're going to have to sacrifice our civil liberties in order to protect our, have our safety. And so Germany went down that very, very dark path of racism and brutal expansionism, resulting in the worst war, the worst catastrophe that the world had ever seen, and probably has seen in all this time. Now, at a certain point, of course, the Soviet Union was attacked by the Germans and their allies, and the Soviet Union defeated Germany, defeated basically 80% of the Axis forces, the fascist forces, and so Germany lost that war again. So the question was, well, what to do with these Nazis? Because these are nasty people. Well, there was this program called denazification, but the problem was that these same elements in the United States that had empowered the Germans during or leading up to World War II, basically gave a pass to many of these German Nazis. So you had people like, there was one guy named Lebet, who was he was a notorious war criminal wanted by the Soviet Union, and the United States spirited him out of Germany, and he ended up in the United States, safe and sound. And there was another guy, Stepan Bandera had his kind of ups and downs with Germany. He was in a prison camp for a while, but basically he got through World War II, but he was causing trouble. The CIA was stirring up trouble in Ukraine which is part of the Soviet Union. And so finally a KGB agent assassinated him. You had people like Werner von Braun and many other high-ranking Nazis came to the United States and were embedded, you could say, in the U.S. political structure. And in fact, the CIA got a lot of instruction from these Nazi war criminals. So you had this. Nazism was never really eradicated in the Federal Republic of Germany, that is the West Germany that was dominated by the British, French, and the United States during the Cold War. But the Soviets did a better job of denazifying East Germany. So as a result, East Germany, the eastern part of Germany, which has now been incorporated into Germany, and politically, it's not as Russophobic, apparently, as the rest of Germany is, and I attribute that to the fact that the brainwashing that the West has foisted on the German people, all during the Cold War, that has been that has created the groundwork, you could say, the seeds of this Russophobia. So the reason why I made this video was because I wanted people to understand that in my judgment, although some people would disagree with me, in my judgment, Germany was not inherently Russophobic. What happens in a society that is under tremendous stress, it went through several breakdowns. They lost World War I, they lost their colonies, they had a terrible hyperinflation, they went through a depression. This dictator, shows up and puts them into another war. They lose that war. So Germany's really been through hell and back several times. And the consequence of that is that the higher levels of consciousness, that is, these great writers and thinkers, they lost their place in German society, and as a result, you have these darker aspects of German culture that have existed for centuries. They basically have gotten control of Germany, and it's very difficult to say where this is all going. Back in I think it was like 1918 and 1920. I forget exactly which year, but there was a woman named Rosa Luxemburg, and she and her sidekick, whose name escapes me at the moment, were basically involved with socialism in Germany, and it was a major social force. There was almost a socialist revolution after World War I, because Germany had suffered so much that the socialists were saying, we didn't want this war, and it was kind of analogous to what happened in Russia. And even in the United States, there was a strong socialist movement. But essentially, the socialist movements, which were in favor of peace and in favor of better equal distribution of wealth in the society, they were and have been systematically suppressed for many, many decades. And so Rosa Luxemburg, there's kind of an epithet. She said, we have a choice. It's either socialism or barbarism. And unfortunately, Germany in World War II chose barbarism over socialism, and they seem to be heading back in that direction. The new chancellor, Friedrich Merz, he doesn't like to talk about it, but his grandfather was a fairly high-ranking Nazi official. And recently he has come out with some pretty outrageous statements like, well, I can understand why German people are afraid of fighting Russia, but they shouldn't be afraid. Don't worry about that. and we need to arm ourselves, and maybe we need to bring back conscription, where young men are going to be forced to go into the military. And these are all really bad signs. And but this is the kind of person who has gotten power in Germany. And the problem is, of course, is that the United States nurtures all this. So, as I've mentioned in other videos and other articles, the Dulles brothers, Allen Dulles, he became the head of the CIA. He was negotiating with the Nazis during World War II to have a separate peace with the Nazis behind Franklin Delano Roosevelt's back. It was like treasonous, and yet he got away with it. John Foster Dulles, he was a lawyer for the Nazis. Was it Prescott Bush, who was the grandfather of George W. Bush and the father of George H. Walker Bush? He was banker for the Nazis. There was a book called Trading with the Enemy, where Charles Higham talked about the fact that U.S. industrialists were not just financing but equipping the Nazis. So when people say, "Oh, it's just Germany is crazy," well, it's not so simple. The reality is that the worst elements in German society have been nurtured by what I would say are the worst elements in American society, the U.S. society. And that has brought us to the point where we're, flirting with the Third World War or even nuclear war. So that's what I want to talk about here. As I mentioned, I have a whole article that follows this video that I've given you with a lot of background information. I talk about the fact that Germany got involved with colonialism, European colonialism, which resulted in easily 100 million deaths. It's probably the most terrible time in human history was the period of Western colonialism, where it wasn't just Germany, it wasn't just France or England or Spain or Portugal, the Netherlands, Belgium. All of those countries were involved in really horrific exploitation and brutality in the rest of the planet. And what is changing is the fact that the rest of the planet has gradually overcome that gross imbalance that has been going on for the last 500 years, and now they're pushing back. So this is at the core of what is going on now, in the United States and Europe are getting desperate because they can feel themselves losing control, and as they lose control, they start resorting to desperate actions. So that's the problem that we're facing right now. But in any case, it's not so simple to say that Germany it was all their fault for failing to face the demons that were unleashed before and during World War II. A society can move in different directions, in positive directions or in negative directions, just as a human being can. We often our behavior is often governed by the company we keep, and unfortunately, the Europeans, this is a group of countries with a long history of negativity towards not just each other, because for centuries the Europeans were fighting wars against each other. There was a 30 years war that went on in the 1600s, and many wars, in that whole period. The last 1,000 years, they had the Crusades, invading the Middle East, or Western Asia, or Palestine and that whole area. So that's the problem, is that it's not just to pin it on schizophrenic Germany is a bit simplistic, and the whole what I'm trying to do here is to get people to understand what is the nature of Western civilization and why we need to really take a close look at what has gone wrong with it. It did create great technology. It created great artists and thinkers and philosophers and composers and music and art and all those things. But in parallel with it were these darker forces that have caused tremendous suffering. And how do we deal with that? Well, we have to face it. So this video that I'm presenting to you now is kind of a wake-up call for you to think about these things. So thank you for listening again, and please support my channel if you can, and read the article because it has a lot of information in it. There's also a video by Richard Wolff who talked about the rise of Hitler. His family, he's an economist with a socialist background, and he talks about how his whole family in Germany was actually affected by these traumas. So, and he talks about that, and this is the reason why Hitler, one of the main factors that when you had a country that's seriously vulnerable to this very negative ideology, and it gets help from outside forces like Henry Ford or Prescott Bush and people of that nature. That is why Germany went down that dark path. And of course, now with the people that are running the United States, Germany is being encouraged to go back in that direction. So that's where we're at. Okay, enough ranting on my part. So thank you very much for listening in, and I will talk with you soon.